Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into Louis Armstrong, the innovator's journey. We're going to see exactly how this single musician fundamentally transformed jazz from the ground up. Everyone recognizes that gravelly voice, the huge grin, and the trumpet, right? But his impact goes so far beyond just that iconic image. He essentially rewired the entire DNA of American music. Let's jump right in and see how he did it.
To really wrap our heads around his enduring cultural power, let's kick things off with a little trivia. Picture this. It's 1964, the absolute peak of the British invasion. The Beatles have held the #1 spot on the Billboard Hot 100 for an unbelievable 14 consecutive weeks, with 3 different songs. So, who finally knocked them off that peak?
The answer is a 62-year-old Louis Armstrong. Seriously, he pulled off this monumental feat with his recording of Hello, Dolly, and by doing that, he became the oldest person to ever reach that #1 spot. It just goes to show this massive cross-generational relevance he had. He wasn't just some museum piece from the past. He was an active, dominant force in pop music.
So you might be wondering, how does someone reach that absolute level of dominance? Well, it starts with his origins. Born in 1901, Armstrong spent his youth in severe poverty in a rough, segregated New Orleans neighborhood that was literally known as the battlefield. He was raised mostly by his mother, and get this, by the age of 7, he was already working just to help his family survive in what was easily one of the toughest environments in the country.
But it was actually in this incredibly harsh environment that a bit of early kindness profoundly shaped his path. Young Louis started working for the Karnofskys, a Lithuanian Jewish family who collected rags and delivered coal. They saw this fatherless boy, and they just took him in. Armstrong later wrote that they taught him, quote, how to live, real life, and determination. They even advanced him the money to buy his very first cornet from a local pawn shop. And in their honor, he actually wore a Star of David around his neck for the rest of his life.
Now, looking at this timeline, his musical education ramped up remarkably fast from there. In 1913, after a juvenile arrest for firing a blank gun on New Year's Eve, he was sent to the colored waif's home. There, he learned discipline and actually became the band leader. Fast forward to 1918, and he's playing on the Mississippi River boats with Fate Marable's band. Armstrong always called this his university because it forced him to learn how to sight-read written music. That solid technical foundation is exactly what paved the way for his massive 1922 move to Chicago to join his mentor, King Oliver.
What's really fascinating here is the environment Armstrong stepped into. Chicago, in 1922, was literally booming. Factories were hiring, money was flowing everywhere, and the city was the undisputed center of the jazz universe. Armstrong was playing second cornet to King Oliver, but his own reputation just skyrocketed. People said he could blow 200 high Cs in a row. And he absolutely dominated these late-night cutting contests where musicians would try to outplay each other. He was very quickly becoming an unstoppable force.
Okay, right here is where we see the massive cultural earthquake he caused in music. Before Armstrong came along, early jazz was basically a collective ensemble art. Everyone played together, essentially just playing variations of the song's main melody. But Armstrong totally flipped the paradigm. He was the very first to step forward as an individual and create significant variations based on the chord harmonies underneath the song. He took jazz from a collective folk music and transformed it into a brilliant soloist's art form.
He really cemented this revolution between 1925 and 1928 with his studio bands, the Hot 5 and the Hot 7. As you can see, his innovations were just staggering. We're talking unconventionally sophisticated solos and this intense, driving rhythmic swing with accented upbeats. Young trumpet players across the entire country were buying these records and literally memorizing his solos note for note. He didn't just play jazz, he completely invented the role of the jazz soloist as we know it today.
And his genius absolutely wasn't limited to the trumpet. Take this legendary anecdote from 1926, for example. During a recording session for the song Heebie Jeebies, the story goes that Armstrong accidentally dropped his sheet music on the floor. The tape is rolling, the music is playing, and the studio president just frantically signals for him to keep going.
Well, unable to read the lyrics, Armstrong just starts vocalizing these nonsense syllables right to the beat. This moment of accidental genius ended up popularizing the exact vocal technique we now call scat singing, which is improvised vocal jazz using nonsensical words. That single, spontaneous recording of Heebie Jeebies became a massive hit. It actually made Armstrong's group the most famous jazz band in America, which is wild considering they almost never performed live together.
But his vocal influence didn't stop at scatting. In fact, his style connects directly to the modern pop vocals you probably have on your playlist right now. Armstrong essentially created the archetype for the crooner. Using those newly invented ribbon microphones in the 1930s, his resonant, velvety, lower register tone and strongly syncopated phrasing totally changed how people sang. Heavyweights of the time like Bing Crosby openly admired and copied his style. They moved away from that loud, theatrical belting to a much more conversational, lyrical extension of speech.
Now, while his music was undeniably revolutionary, his actual life was one of extreme contrasts. To the public, he was Satchmo, the joyous, ever-grinning entertainer holding a trumpet. But his gritty, everyday reality involved playing over 300 grueling shows a year on the road. It involved terrifying run-ins with the mob that literally forced him to flee to Europe at one point. And it involved severe lip damage from his incredibly aggressive playing style, which he brutally managed by cutting off his own scar tissue with a razor blade. All of this, by the way, while constantly navigating the incredibly harsh anti-black prejudice of the era.
And speaking of that era, while Armstrong generally avoided public politics, which actually drew some criticism from younger musicians at the time, in 1957, he completely stunned the public. During the Little Rock integration crisis, reporters asked him about President Eisenhower's slow response to school desegregation. Armstrong forcefully denounced the inaction, stating the president was two-faced and adding, "The way they're treating my people in the South, the government can go to hell." He even went as far as canceling a government-sponsored tour over it. He really proved that behind that entertainer's smile was a man of deep, steadfast conviction.
Ultimately, his later years were remarkably complex. Despite dealing with failing health, including severe heart and kidney issues, he took on the role of Ambassador Satch. Sponsored by the U.S. State Department, he toured the world extensively, playing to these massive crowds across Africa, Asia, and even the communist bloc. He became a true global symbol of American culture, bridging immense divides with his music right up until his death in 1971.
So looking back at his entire life, the sheer breadth of his legacy is just staggering. From a desperately poor kid in the battlefield of New Orleans, he popularized the jazz solo itself. He created the very archetype for modern pop vocals. He broke immense racial barriers, gaining access to the upper echelons of society when it was nearly impossible for a black man to do so. And he pushed the physical and musical limits of the trumpet further than anyone ever thought possible.
Which leaves us with this really fascinating thought to ponder. If Louis Armstrong's trumpet birthed the concept of the jazz soloist, and his voice basically taught the world how to croon, where on earth would modern popular music be without him? Every solo you hear, every syncopated pop vocal you sing along to in the car, literally holds a piece of Satchmo's DNA. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I highly encourage you to go give those early Hot 5 recordings a listen today. They are absolutely brilliant.